I wonder if you wondered what songs were topping the hit parade in 1855, or 1840, or 1875. What were the songs our great-great-grandfathers flocked to hear at the concert hall, the music hall, the theatre, or the dance hall, and to purchase in sheet music form by the thousand and in some cases the million? Well, the answer, or part of it, for Victorian popular music covers a vast field, is given by Joseph Cooper in Victorian Top of the Pops tonight at 7:30, when he'll be presenting songs and piano music taken mostly from the early Victorian period. Radio 4. Story time. Peter Barkworth reads the last of 3 ghost stories, abridged for radio by Neville Teller. Today's story is The Tudor Chimney, by A.N.L. Munby.
I'm an indefatigable note-taker, and a lifetime of antiquarian studies has led to a most formidable accumulation of material. I've never catalogued my entries, but luckily I have a memory above the average. And once, my memory stood me in very good stead. When Simon Venn first told me of his project, I supported it enthusiastically, for he's a very rich man. To restore a derelict house to its former glory is no occupation for the possessor of a modest income. Though the initial purchase of such a property may be effected for the proverbial song, the illusion of a bargain is soon shattered by the long face of the inspecting architect and by still longer accounts from the local builder. But considerations of this nature weigh little with a man whose fortune is based upon the secure foundation of a century-old whiskey distillery. The finding, however, of a suitable house for renovation proved surprisingly difficult. He told me that he'd explored perhaps a score of properties offered by optimistic agents and had begun to despair of ever being able to dissipate his surplus wealth in this delightful way. So, in a fit of pique, he removed himself to the south of France. It was in the following May, the year was 1924, that I next heard from him. He had returned to England and had happened upon the ideal house for his scheme in Berkshire. Nothing would suffice but that I came down at once to see it. The purchase had been completed and work was already beginning. The letter was headed The Old Hall, Diddenham, a village which lay, according to my friend's information, in the downs between Wantage and Lambourne. Such an invitation was much to my liking. I consulted my engagement book, told several white lies over the telephone, and found myself possessed of 4 clear days. A telegram to Venn, some hasty packing, and my arrangements were complete. By noon, I was speeding along the Great West Road, pleasantly deserted on a fine midweek morning. I have always loved the spacious chalk uplands, and Venn had chosen to settle in an area much favoured by ancient man. The prehistory of the neighbourhood was fairly well known to me. The White Horse and Uffington Castle had been visited and revisited, but I had never before approached this stretch of the downs from the south side. Some way short of the summit, I turned up a side lane, breasted a ridge, and before me I saw what I knew must be my destination. I stopped the car and gazed in appreciation at the scene before me. 300 yards away was the house, set in a re-entrant of the hill and sheltered on 3 sides, a building whose mellow red brick glowed in the afternoon sun. I tried to guess its date and put it down as early 16th century, which I subsequently learned was an accurate estimate. It was built upon an H plan, and at each end was a great multiple chimney stack, displaying those spiral brick chimneys which were so dear to the heart of the Tudor builder. Round one of the stacks, scaffolding had been erected, from which I presumed that Venn had wasted no time in getting to work. I restarted the car, and in a couple of minutes I was receiving a smiling greeting from my host's manservant, an old acquaintance of mine, and a great chatterbox. "Well, Dawson," I said, "and how do you like your new home?" "It's very nice, sir, and by the time Mr. Venn is finished with it, it shall be a regular showpiece. But I shall be very surprised if we get the workmen out this side of Christmas. I can't understand what's come over the master. I mean, take the dining room, for instance. It may be a bit on the small side, but it's cosy, like intimate, if you know what I mean. Well, Mr. Venn is not only joining it up with the drawing room, but believe it or not, he's going to take the first floor out, so that it goes right up to the roof. I've never heard of such a thing. I mean, think of heating the place, sir. He broke off suddenly as my friend appeared and became very busy picking up my bags. "I heard you, Dawson," said Venn, and added as the old man went off with my luggage, "Poor old Dawson. I'm afraid he doesn't appreciate the excitement of tracing out exactly where the great hall used to be. I'm delighted that you've come. Now, we've got an hour before tea. Just nice time to give you a general view of the place. I'll show you the plans for restoration after dinner." It would be unreasonable to inflict on you an account of my tour of the house, but I will admit that Venn's enthusiasm was amply justified. The latent possibilities of the place were enormous. It was just on 4 o'clock by the time we reached the ground floor again. "There's just one more thing I'd like you to see before tea," said Venn, leading the way into a small room at the east end of the house. "Now, what do you think of that? Isn't it extraordinary?" He was pointing to the fireplace, which appeared to be the oldest and was certainly the finest in the house. Above the great stone Tudor arch was a chimney-piece of carved oak, richly decorated with mythological figures and heraldic devices. The extraordinary aspect of this splendid relic lay in its being bricked up. The whole of the fireplace had been walled across. "This room was one half of the small parlour of the Tudor house," said Venn, "and I intend to join it up with the housekeeper's room next door and use it as my study. But can you conceive anyone bricking up this magnificent fireplace?" At this moment, a workman entered the room. Venn nodded and said, "How long would it take you to knock a few bricks out of this?" He tapped the walled-in area as he spoke. The workman cast a professional eye over it. "Well, sir, if it's only 1 brick thick, I should say about 20 minutes. Would you like me to have a go at it, sir? I mean, just in the middle. I won't go near the stonework at the sides in case I damage it." He seized a hammer and chisel, and as we went off, the little room resounded with the ring of steel upon mortar. We had nearly finished tea when the parlourmaid brought a message that the man working on the chimney would like to have a word with Mr. Venn. He entered awkwardly. Beg pardon, sir, but I hope I haven't done wrong with that chimney. I knocked an hole in them bricks like what you said, but there isn't half a nasty smell coming out of it." We rose and followed him back to the scene of his operations. As we filed into the room, the cause of his perturbation became apparent. There was a smell, not very strong, but nonetheless insistent, an infinitely stale reek of burnt fat and offal. The effect was, to say the least, disagreeable. Venn flung the windows open, and some of the pungency was lost. "Well, I think it's just the stale air from the chimney," he said. "Just loosen some more bricks and let's see if it's blocked higher up." It was the work of only a few minutes to enlarge the aperture to a respectable size, and Venn cautiously inserted his head and shoulders. "Oh, I can see the sky," he said. Yes, there's no other blockage. Now, I can't see anything that..." He withdrew his head sharply as something came fluttering down inside the flue and stuck on the jagged hole in the brickwork. I took the tongs from the stove and pulled it out, but it was only a small bundle of rags, filthy and charred. I dropped them back into the grate. I'm a reasonably early riser, and the following day I resolved to take a short walk before breakfast. It was thus that I inadvertently overheard a conversation at the foot of the stairs. Well, I call it a conversation, though it was more in the nature of a monologue delivered by the charwoman, a stout lady of about 50 who'd been pointed out to me on the previous day. The workman, with whom I was already acquainted, formed the reluctant audience. "You You men are all the same, she was saying. You eat your heads off and expect everyone to run about clearing up after you. I'm a reasonable woman, but what I say is there's necessary mess and there's unnecessary mess. I know you can't carry out alterations without breaking the place up, but when it comes to strewing your nasty burnt rags up and down my clean passages, that's another thing altogether, and I won't have it. The workman made his escape, and I descended the stairs. I remember wondering idly how it was that the rags, apparently from the chimney, should have found their way into the passage, but the whole thing seemed too trivial to worry about. I took a brisk walk up on the hillside and returned to breakfast half an hour later in high spirits. The day passed pleasantly enough. At about 10, my host's architect arrived. I liked Henson, a youngish man and a wholehearted enthusiast for the scheme. Our pleasure was, however, slightly marred by one thing. In different parts of the house, we kept getting occasional whiffs of the smell from the unblocked chimney. The chimney itself, which we examined, was quite free of it, and its source remained elusive. The flue, upon inspection, proved to be quite clear. I don't want you to think that we took all this very seriously at the time, but I'm telling you of it in the knowledge of what was to come. And these apparent trivialities then take on a more somber aspect. It was on the following morning that we got our first inkling of more sinister matters. After breakfast, I went to join Venn in the library. As I opened the door, I noticed his old manservant, Dawson, was seated in a chair, in itself an unusual occurrence, and was engaged in earnest conversation with his master. I was about to retire, but Venn said, "Come and listen to this. Dawson says he's seen a ghost." Well, I could see that he was worried. I knew Venn was genuinely fond of the old man, and he looked pale and shaken as he sat hunched into one of the library armchairs. "Well, sir, that's how it is," said Dawson. I couldn't stay another night in this house. Not if you were to pay me £1,000,000. Not but what I shall be very sorry to leave you, sir, and after all these years, too. But I'm not as young as I used to be, and another turn like the one I got last night would just about finish me. I didn't sleep a wink, sir. All night long I could see that figure standing there at the foot of the stairs looking at me. It fair gives me the creeps to talk about it now." "Well, what we'd better do is this, Dawson," said my friend. "You were going to take your holiday anyway, in a month's time. Were you going to stay with your married sister at Hunstanton again?" Dawson nodded. "Well, let's send her a prepaid wire and see if she can have you now. There's no hurry about your coming back. You can take an extra month if you like, and by that time we shall have got this place a bit more shipshape. I expect the upheaval of the move has upset you, but I'm certainly not going to accept your notice straight away. Now see how you feel in 6 weeks' time. What do you say about that?" With apparent reluctance, Dawson allowed himself to be persuaded into accepting these arrangements. The wire was sent, a favourable reply was received, and by midday, Dawson and his luggage had left for the station. At lunch, I asked Venn what exactly it was that Dawson had seen. "Well, that's exactly the stupid part of it," he said. "He either couldn't or wouldn't give any coherent account of it. All he did was keep repeating some nonsense about a figure standing and looking at him. So he was so upset I didn't like to press him for any further details. The only thing he did say at all definite was that the appearance was accompanied by a fearful smell, which is, of course, suggestive. So I'm beginning to think that perhaps I was a bit hasty in having that chimney unblocked." It is with extreme reluctance that I come to the next part of my story. I do not even now like to remind myself of the horror and panic that seized me. But I'm anticipating. Venn and I spent the evening together in the library. He had some letters to write, and I was quite content to smoke and examine his books. At about 10:30, he rose from his bureau and said he was going to bed. Well, I said that I'd read for a little longer. I was sitting not far from the door, and the room was lit by a single reading lamp. I was smoking my pipe, and after about 20 minutes I found it necessary to refill it. It was then that I first realized that the smell, which I was coming to know so well, was pervading the room. At the first whiff of that sickening reek, I sat quite still and listened. But I could hear nothing. Nonetheless, the atmosphere of the room had changed in some infinitely subtle way. The gloom, outside the range of the single light, seemed to have become more intense and to have assumed an oppressive, malignant quality. The mild May evening seemed to have grown colder, for I was conscious of shivering. As I sat there holding my breath, I was aware that I was not alone in the room. Something else was present, immediately behind me. How I detected this, I do not know, but I was nonetheless certain of it. With an effort of willpower, I slowly turned my head, for I was intensely curious. I wish to heaven now I'd not given way to my curiosity, for what I saw still haunts me. Just on the outer edge of the lamplight, a figure was standing, and I hope I never see anything again so monstrous and so repellent. It was a man, but it had the aspect of no living man. Its form was covered with the charred remnants of clothing. The bare legs were horribly thin. They were nothing but burnt skin and blackened bone. But it was the head that made my very blood run cold. It was hairless and scorched, and the face was nothing more than a featureless, seared, leathery mask. It was the face of a man long dead, but the eyes were alive. They glowed behind the mask with a baleful, infernal light that radiated malevolence. In far less time than it takes to speak these words, I was on the far side of the door and fumbling with the key. The lock was stiff from long disuse, and I found it would not turn. As I struggled with it, something gripped the handle on the far side and pulled. Sick with panic, I tugged with one hand, and with the other I wrestled with the lock. With a sudden jerk, the key turned, and I was standing sweating and panting in the dark passage. On the panels of the door, I could hear something scraping and scratching. I ran as fast as my legs could carry me up to Ven's room. He was in bed, but jumped up when he saw me. "Good heavens, man," he said. "What's the matter with you? Sit down." I looked at myself in the mirror and realized the cause of his consternation. I was white and breathless, and my face was moist with beads of sweat. He poured me out a glass of brandy from his medicine chest, and as I gulped it down, I told him what I'd seen. His first reaction was to go to the door and lock it. Far into the night, we discussed the matter. Ven decided that, as the following day was a Sunday and the workmen would not be coming, he would move his belongings to the inn at Lambourne and stay there for a while. The two servants could easily be given a holiday. The work of restoration could continue by daylight for the time being, but no one would sleep in the house. I questioned him closely on what he knew of the history of the place, but he had little to tell me. "I do remember one thing," the agent told me, he said. "It hasn't always been called the Old Hall. Originally it had another name. He told me what it was. I'm damned if I can remember it now." "What about the heraldry on the chimney-piece?" I said. "That ought to tell us who one of the early owners was. As far as I recollect, there was a coat of 3 birds' heads. Ravens, I think. Does the name Raven mean anything to you? Or perhaps Crow? Or some combination incorporating either of them? Crowby, Crowley." "Crosley," interjected Ven. "That was it. Crosley Hall was the original name." I was silent for a long time. The name of Crosley had stirred some vague chord in my mind. I was almost certain that embedded somewhere in my voluminous notebooks, I had some information relating to the name of Crosley, and I decided it was worth a visit to London in the morning to see if I could find it. I set off early, leaving Ven to arrange for the move to Lambourne, where I promised to join him in the evening. I spent the day delving among my accumulated papers and cursed myself, not for the first time, for my failure to compile an index. The afternoon was well advanced before I found that my memory had not played me false. I had made extensive notes upon the family of Crosley, and certain passages which I transcribed 20 years before seem to have a considerable bearing upon our present troubles. I returned to Lambourne forthwith, and this is the gist of what I had to tell Venn after supper. The fortunes of the House of Crosley were founded, like those of many more famous families, upon lands acquired at the dissolution of the monasteries. A certain Thomas Crosley was steward to the great Benedictine Abbey of Abingdon, and was thus able to sell to himself several of the abbey's richest manors upon exceedingly advantageous terms. Among these, he purchased Didenham, with its small manor house, which was largely rebuilt and named Crosley Hall by its new occupant. Thus it was that almost overnight the steward became a landowner. His elevation to the status of gentleman was not long delayed, as he received a grant of arms in 1547 and chose for his coat the punning device of the 3 birds' heads. This was embodied in the great oak chimney-piece, as we've seen. The majority of such parvenu families quickly adapted themselves to their new positions, but this was not the case with the Crosleys. In modern parlance, they did not fit in. They lived in constant friction with their neighbours, and by the days of the early Stuarts, they had become the most universally detested family in the country. In 1640, the head of the family was a certain Julius Crosley, a bachelor who lived alone at the Hall. He possessed all the unpleasant characteristics of his immediate forebears, and his arrogance and insolence were a byword. One day he was out riding beyond the bounds of his estate. A closed gate barred his path, and he shouted to a boy standing nearby to open it for him. Whether the boy made some impertinent reply or was merely slow in complying, history does not relate, but the horseman lost his temper. He felled the child with the butt end of his whip and passed on. The boy, who was the son of a much-respected yeoman farmer, sickened and died. The smouldering resentment of the countryside broke into flame, and Julius Crosley was apprehended by the sheriff's men and brought to trial. In view of the high feeling that his action had aroused, the prisoner exercised his option to be tried not at Reading Assizes, but in London. Here he managed to produce medical evidence that the boy was already ailing, and in view of the conflicting testimony of the doctors, he escaped with a fine. On May the 1st, 1640, he returned to his manor in triumph. The county was in an uproar, and 2 nights later, a party of friends of the bereaved family broke into the house, intent on vengeance. What occurred is not recorded. Julius Crosley disappeared, and his body was never found, nor were his assailants ever arrested. These were the facts I'd gleaned from my notes. It needed little imagination to supply the end of the story. I could picture Julius Crosley in his house that evening, startled by the sudden arrival of the armed men, his surprise turning to panic as he realized their mission. He would have sought about for some hiding place, and some unlucky chance must have led him to climb up into the chimney of the small parlour. Perhaps his presence there was detected or revealed by some treacherous servant, and his merciless pursuers kindled a fire in the hearth. I could picture the man's feelings as the first spirals of smoke eddied round him, and the tongues of flame began to lick around his feet. He would blindly have climbed higher, desperately clawing at the sooty brickwork. The chimney was too narrow at the top to allow the passage of a man's body, but one hopes that he was suffocated by the smoke into merciful unconsciousness before the flames had done their work. So much one could guess. Yet why was the spirit of the tortured man not at rest? The rest of the story can be told in a few words. How we summoned Henson, the architect, upon the following day, how close examination of the chimney revealed a disused side flue, which with some difficulty was uncovered behind the wainscoting in the room immediately above. The pitiful remains which we unearthed there were given a decent burial in the little churchyard of Didenham. The sombre shadows of mystery and horror were thus dispelled, and the old house was at peace once more. The work of restoration is now complete, and I am a frequent visitor. Dawson is in residence again and is as talkative as ever, except, of course, upon one particular subject.
The Tudor Chimney by A.N.L. Munby was abridged for radio by Neville Teller, and the reader was Peter Barkworth. The production was by Harry Catlin. The Tudor Chimney is from an anthology entitled The Thrill of Horror, edited by Hugh Lamb and published in 1975 by W.H. Allen. Next week in Storytime, Martin Jarvis will be reading Wartime William, 5 episodes from Richmal Crompton's Just William stories. And Peter Barkworth, whom we've just heard reading our ghost story, reappears tomorrow night in a rather different role. He'll be recreating his stage and television performances as Edward VIII in the story of the abdication crisis of 1936, which forms the basis of our special Christmas night play, Crown Matrimonial. Gwen Franken-Davis plays Queen Mary, Martin Jarvis and Jane Wenham play the Duke and Duchess of York in Crown Matrimonial at 8:30 tomorrow night, Christmas night.